I'm Marge Baker, Executive Vice President of People for the American Way. Thank you so much for joining us for this National Town Hall. What's at stake? The Barrett Supreme Court nomination. As we'll hear today, just about everything we all hold dear is at stake, from this unprecedented rush to fill the seat vacated by the death of the iconic Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Today, you'll hear from senators in the thick of this fight, from key civil rights leaders who are working to protect our core rights and liberties, and from individual Americans threatened by the harm portended by Barrett's confirmation. As you will hear, at risk is whether we all have access to affordable health care, whether our right to abortion and contraception care will be undermined, whether the pillars of our democracy and our right to vote will be upended. We have a full list of speakers today, so without further ado, I am proud to introduce civil rights champion, former head of the NAACP, and now I am proud to say President of People for the American Way, Ben Jealous. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Marge, and thank you to all of you for joining this call. I'm Ben Jealous, President of People for the American Way. And we're proud to be in this work with so many activists across the country standing up for healthcare, standing up for civil rights, standing up for a woman's right to choose, and standing up against President Trump pushing through one more justice onto the Supreme Court, ensuring that there'll be a far right-wing majority, do grave damage to healthcare and so many other things that we hold dear. I'm grateful to the leadership of the senators that you see on this call, to their commitment to ensure that we ultimately recover from the damage that Barrett will do should all this go through. One of those great senators who's joined us today and who's been a champion in this fight, standing up for the health care of people across this country, some of whom you'll hear from today, is Senator Patty Murray of Washington. She is the ranking member of the Health Committee. She is a strong advocate for health care, a strong advocate for women's rights, and it's an honor to be in this fight with her. Senator?
Well, Ben, thank you so much. I am so glad to be with all of you and be joined by my colleagues, Senators Hirono and Cardin and Casey are all on, and by so many powerful health care advocates. You know, it should be unthinkable that in the middle of a pandemic, when healthcare is more important than ever, Republicans want to take it away, make it more expensive, and throw millions of families' lives into jeopardy. Yet here we are. Republicans know perfectly well what's at stake for the families they represent, which is why they have been trying so hard to pretend the Supreme Court fight isn't about healthcare. But they are not fooling anyone. We remember their many votes to attack families' healthcare. We remember President Trump's promise to pick judges who would rule against patients and families. We know Judge Barrett's record indicates that she would strike down protections for patients with pre-existing conditions. We know the court will hear a Republican lawsuit that could do just that days after Republicans want to confirm her. And if there weren't already enough warning signs, the day after President Trump nominated her, he tweeted that a ruling to upend healthcare in this country would be a, quote, big win. Big win. A big win for Republicans, maybe. A big win for billionaires and corporations that would get a tax cut. And a big win for insurance companies, no doubt. But people in my home state of Washington and across the country know it would be a huge loss for their families. And they are speaking up about it. Michael from Paulsbo in Washington State, for instance, has intracranial hypertension. It is a potential debilitating disease. If Republicans get their way, insurance companies could discriminate against him and over 130 million other patients with a pre-existing condition by charging more, excluding benefits, or denying coverage altogether. Another Michael from Seattle spent 62 days in the hospital fighting COVID-19. His care cost well over $1 million, thankfully, most of which was covered by his health plan. But an expense like that could be a crisis in and of itself for patients if Republicans win this lawsuit and insurance companies can set lifetime and annual caps on benefits. Maze from SeaTac, it's a town just north of Seattle, has several health care conditions that put her at risk of dying in her sleep. But thanks to Medicaid expansion, she has the health care coverage she needs. A Supreme Court win for Republicans would take health care away for her and tens of millions of others, including patients like Rhiannon from Arlington, diabetic, 22 years old, and on her parents' insurance. It would undermine care for Myra from Bellingham, who has a bipolar condition, but thanks to essential health benefits, insurance are required to cover prescription drugs and mental health care for patients like her, just like they are required to provide preventive care like birth control, which Wendy from Seattle counts on, not just as a contraception, but to manage debilitating menstrual cramps. But Republicans are fighting to end that too. And of course, birth control is just a tip of the iceberg when it comes to what is at stake for women's health and reproductive rights in this fight. Republicans' healthcare lawsuit would empower insurers to charge patients like Wendy and Mylan and Rhiannon more just for being a woman. And we can't forget that Judge Barrett has made clear she would also help Republicans achieve their dangerous goal of overturning Roe v. Wade and undermining safe, legal abortion. In short, there is so much at stake in this fight for so many people. For each of the stories I've shared today, there are countless others. And I'm incredibly grateful to all the people who are joining this call today to share their stories personally. Republicans may be trying to rush Judge Barrett onto the Supreme Court before people can have their say about it on November 3rd. But make no mistake, the people will have their say. Across the country, they are standing up, they are speaking out, and they are fighting back. And together, we are going to make sure Republicans hear them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Murray, and thank you for bringing home the reality of what it means if the Affordable Care Act were to be overturned. Can't thank you enough for all the work you're doing and for telling this incredibly important story. So thank you so much for being with us. And now it's my deep honor and privilege to introduce Senator Mazie Hirono, a champion on the Senate Judiciary Committee, who just went through the shall we say, the faux hearings that we had last week, and would love to hear from you, Senator Hirono, and thank you so much for your work. You're on mute.
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Thank you all for putting this call together and for all the people who are joining us, as we say in Hawaii, mahalo. And it is great to join my colleagues, Senators Murray, Cardin, and Casey. And I'm glad to follow Patty, especially because she has been a champion of healthcare for our country and particularly for women. And as we all know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a champion for women's equality, civil rights, voting rights, LGBTQ rights, you name it. She was there with us. And now she is gone. The Republicans are so intent on replacing her, in spite of the fact that she said her most fervent wish was that her replacement be after a new president is installed. They are rushing ahead. Why? Because after 70 times voting to totally repeal the Affordable Care Act in Congress, they're now taking to the courts to do that which they couldn't do legislatively. So yes, they rushed a hearing with a person who identifies herself with Scalia in terms of judicial philosophy and how she would approach constitutional and other questions. We got very little from her in terms of any kind of a window into how she would view the most important case that she'll hear right off the bat, November 10th, the Affordable Care Act case. And she often responded by saying, well, I'll follow the law, or I can't talk about that. She is a clear and present danger to everyone's health care, and that is why all of the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee brought pictures of constituents and others who would be very much harmed if the Affordable Care Act is struck down. I talked about a young teacher in Hawaii named Jordan who has a very rare condition that requires medication costing $500,000 a year. And were it not for the coverage she could get under the Affordable Care Act, there would be lifetime limits, and she would not be able to afford the medication that is keeping her alive and enabling her to be a teacher. So she is one of millions. I think one of the really important things that we did not get from Judge Barrett is whether she would consider all of these kinds of impacts, real life impacts that people would experience through her decisions. And she really wouldn't respond. She kept saying things like, I'll follow the law. So the millions of people, well, we know that if the Affordable Care Act is struck down, which is exactly what Trump wants to do right off the bat. In fact, that was his promise, that I am going to appoint a Supreme Court nominee who will strike down the Affordable Care Act, who will not do what Chief Justice Roberts did in sustaining the act. And by the way, we all know that Judge Barrett criticized Chief Justice Roberts for stretching the Constitution to the limits to uphold the Affordable Care Act. So she made it pretty plain where she would fall in terms of her originalist approach to not just the Affordable Care Act, but so many other battles that we thought we'd won in the area of LGBTQ rights and, of course, Roe v. Wade. So I am afraid that she is not going to be particularly swayed by the fact that 23 million people will lose their health care should the ACA be struck down, or that 135 million or so people with pre-existing conditions would no longer get the support or the protections of the ACA, not to mention the 8 million COVID positive Americans who will probably be thrown into the group with pre-existing conditions, and some 8.7 million women who will not have access to maternity care, and that would be particularly negatively impacting Blacks and women of color. So all of what we could get from her, aside from her saying, I side with Scalia, that I will follow the law, which means nothing. We have our writings, we have our positions. And so, yes, the Affordable Care Act is very much at risk with her accession to the Supreme Court. In addition, she has a very, it's an outlier view on precedent. Her view on precedent is every justice has a duty to view the Constitution in her own light, her own assessment. And if the precedent is contrary to that assessment, then she will not vote to uphold the precedent. So that means that all of the precedents, which include, of course, Roe v. Wade, Obergefell, which enable gay couples to marry, and which, by the way, her mentor, Scalia, wrote every single dissent on gay rights cases, including Obergefell, those are all at risk with her being put on the Supreme Court for any number of reasons. We need to mobilize. Yes, unless we can get 2 more Republicans to gain a conscience, it is going to be mighty tough to keep her off the Supreme Court. However, you know, we're not done. The elections are here. Millions and millions of people have voted. And as far as I'm concerned, most of the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee supported Mitch McConnell's rule in 2016, saying, well, we should wait in a situation like this for the people to decide who the president should be. And they did a total 180. So the constituents who live in the states where these incumbent Republican senators are should ask them, why can't we trust you? Why can't you live up to your word? Why are you doing this? Why are you pushing this person through? Why are you going to be voting for somebody who is going to take away our health care? Every single one of them, the Republicans should be held accountable, and they can do that through their votes. So they should vote as though their lives depend on it, because certainly their health care will depend on it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Senator Hirono, and thank you for all of your work on the Senate Judiciary Committee and really explaining the scope of the risk here and demonstrating that Barrett simply did not meet the burden she had of proving that she was worthy of this promotion to the Supreme Court. So thank you so much for all that you're doing.
Thank
and
you
I know
all.
it's going to be a very busy week. And now, if I could introduce one of my heroes, a strong supporter of a fair and impartial judiciary, civil rights champion, just a stalwart representative of the desires and hopes of the American people, Senator Ben Cardin. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator Cardin.
Well, Marge, first of all, thank you for your leadership, and to Ben Jealous and to all that are responsible. I know that Nina Aaron's on the call and others. Thank you for your leadership on behalf of the rights of all Americans. And I'm pleased to join my colleagues. I think Mazie Hirono gave a really good summary of what happened during the hearings, and the fact that our concerns were even made more pronounced as a result of that hearing about how she would rule as a justice. And to Patty Murray, who went through the healthcare challenges that will clearly be brought up as a result of the hearing before the Supreme Court in November on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. It's good to be here with Bob Casey. Senator Casey knows firsthand how important this case is. There was just a ruling this week before the Supreme Court, a 4-4 ruling in regards to voting rights that allowed the states that have the rights to determine their voting, as long as they don't violate constitutional provisions, in which that was being challenged to overrule the rights of the states. And that should have been an 8-0 opinion. It was a 4-4 opinion with Chief Justice Roberts ruling on the right side. Just think if Judge Barrett was Justice Barrett, how that decision would have come out. So this is real. The problems that we have are really frightening. So we all should be motivated by Justice Ginsburg. What an inspiration she was to all of us, how she fought and how strategic she was and how she was able to articulate, whether she was in the majority or in the minority. Her minority opinions led to changes in policy. She was really our hero. And as Senator Hirono said, her dying wish was that the president should do the right thing and should withhold this nomination until after the next president takes the oath of office in January. But Senator McConnell didn't follow that. He changed the rules again in order to do his power politics. This is a senator who's not living up by his word, who changes the rules to suit himself. The rules that apply to Democrats won't apply to Republicans. We have never confirmed the Supreme Court justice this close to an election because the election is already taking place, and we should yield to the will of the voters. So this is just an outrageous process that is being used, rushing this forward. Instead, we should be dealing with COVID-19, and we're not even dealing with COVID-19. Senator McConnell is not even allowing us to have that type of debate. So you heard about the Affordable Care Act, and I could give you so many examples. I got a call this week from a person I know, Robin, who heard fear in her voice. She has muscular dystrophy. She knows she's at risk. And it was very clear in listening to her, the fear that she has, that she will not be able to take care of her illness because she won't have adequate insurance protection. With the Supreme Court ruling this November, next month, on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. It's not just coverage in the middle of a pandemic. It's not just pre-existing conditions, 8 million people being added to the numbers who now have COVID-19, which will be a pre-existing condition and risk losing their coverage. Hundreds of millions, so it's over 100 million Americans have pre-existing conditions. It's the expansion of Medicaid and people becoming uninsured. It's the loss of essential healthcare benefits, protection for mental health, protection for addiction. All those areas are at risk. It's caps on insurance protection that was there before we had ACA. All of those are at risk as a result of this nomination and the likely decision by the Supreme Court of the United States with a Judge Barrett becoming Justice Barrett. And we could give you the same fears about corporate America versus the rights of consumers versus the rights of workers versus the rights to a clean environment. All of those are going to be tilted more against our families and against workers and against our environment and against safety of workers. All that's at risk. Or we could talk about a women's right of choice. We've already mentioned that several times, at risk. Or we could talk about so many different issues that are critical that could be decided by the Supreme Court. This is a consequential nomination. So look, we're going to continue to fight to try to find 2 more Republicans to show some courage and defer this nomination until after the next president takes the oath of office. We're going to do everything we possibly can because the stakes could not be higher. So I'm proud to be on your team. We're going to articulate this. We're going to fight for this. We're going to do everything we can to let the American people know exactly what's at stake, because literally your life is at stake in regards to what is likely to happen if Judge Barrett becomes Justice Barrett. Thank you very much. And again, it's an honor to join this group.
Thank you so much for being with us, Senator Cardin, and for all the work that you're doing. And now it's my real privilege to introduce the President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, my friend, my colleague, our fearless leader, Vanita Gupta.
Thank you so much. I'm so appreciative to the senators who have spoken for their championing of civil rights and democratic principles and norms.
Vanita, I think we're having a little bit of trouble with the sound. I'm wondering if we might go to Nan and then see if we can fix that up. So this is also lifelong friend, somebody I've been in the trenches with for many, many, many years, Nan Aaron, who's the president of the Alliance for Justice.
Thank you, Marge, and thanks so much for having us, and thanks to People for the American Way. And it's wonderful to hear from Senators Murray and Cardin and Hirono, all wonderful champions in the Senate. What a moment for all of us. Everything is on the line at the moment. This perhaps is the most consequential decision made by Donald Trump during his presidency. And how much is at stake? The legitimacy of our election, our access to health care, reproductive freedom, and the list goes on. We now have lost over 220,000 lives to COVID, and millions are more saddled with a lifelong illness. Trump and Senate Republicans have shown absolutely no leadership in responding to these paramount concerns. Their eagerness to further entrench their extreme views on the Supreme Court demonstrate they have no concern for leading or protecting the people of this nation. We know they only want judges who will overturn Roe versus Wade and do away with the right to abortion. And how do we know that? They've told us that. We know that they only want judges who will overturn the Affordable Care Act and take access to health care away from millions of Americans. How do we know that? They've told us that. And from the hearing, we know that everything is on the table. From marriage equality to other aspects of settled law, Barrett was clear that she would be open to revisiting issues related to consumers, the environment, workers, women, and civil rights. Barrett wouldn't even say if Medicare was constitutional. Failed to affirm the privacy protections established in the Griswold decision, and refused to comment as to whether it was illegal to intimidate voters at the polls. Quite simply, the fate of the next 50 years of civil and human rights, our democracy and public health is at stake. We will fight this nominee with everything we can. This injustice must not come to pass. I want to thank Senate Democrats and my friends on this call for leading this fight and passionately discussing what's at stake for our Supreme Court and, equally important, the American people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nan. And I'm going to check and see if we can get Vanita back on. Yes, it looks like we can. Vanita Gupta, President of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And while we're waiting for Vanita's video to come up, I just wanted to make sure that folks know we've been talking about calling the senators. Your voice can make a difference. The call-in number, 202-224-3121. Anyone listening, we're at a critical time. The Senate Judiciary Committee is going to vote on Thursday, and if she's passed out of the committee, it's going to be a race to the floor. So please call your senators now, 202-224-3121. And Vanita, it looks like we have you back.
Marge, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Thumbs up.
Great. Okay. Thank you to the senators for speaking and for being such champions for civil rights and for our democracy. Thank you, PFAW, for your leadership, and to my colleagues on this call who have been leaders on the fight for fair courts for so long. Good afternoon. President Trump, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham insult Justice Ginsburg's legacy as they recklessly push through the Supreme Court nominee. First, more than 20 million people have already voted. Millions more are voting as we speak. They are casting ballots for the president and senators that they want to make this monumental decision. And yet Trump, McConnell, Graham, and the entire Senate GOP refuse to listen to voters who know that healthcare is at stake. They know Roe versus Wade is at stake. They know that voting rights, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, and so many more are at stake. It is truly reprehensible to move forward before the next president is installed. Second, we're in the middle of a pandemic that is devastating lives. More than 215,000 people have died of COVID-19 related issues in this country. Unemployment, evictions, and food insecurity are rising. And instead of keeping people safe, Trump, McConnell, and Graham are rushing through a nominee who is selling our rights and access to healthcare down the river. There is much more important business right now, given what American people and families are enduring during this pandemic. And lastly, to that point, Judge Barrett was chosen because powerful interests know that she's on their side, because her record shows clear disdain for the Affordable Care Act, because she said in her own words, abortion access is always immoral. And during last week's hearing, it was clear that she didn't want to know or claim to not know that voter intimidation is illegal. She wouldn't say presidents should commit to peaceful transfers of power. She wouldn't say Medicare is constitutional. She wouldn't say climate change is real. She couldn't remember that the right to protest is in the First Amendment. Simply put, she is unfit for a lifetime position on our highest court. Corporate interests and their allies in the US Senate have worked for years to stack the courts to ensure that they work for them, not for all of us. If we're to have courts that protect equal justice for everyone, we need a nominee who will defend our civil and human rights. Amy Coney Barrett is not that nominee. It's simply outrageous that the Senate majority is breaking the rules to keep this nomination moving amid this pandemic, while people in the millions and millions are voting all across America. We need everyone who cares about equal justice to call their senators and tell them to oppose Barrett's confirmation. The fight isn't over, and thanks to all of these senators who are fighting for us, including Senators Hirono, Cardin, and Casey. And thanks to all of you for joining us today and for doing all you are doing to push for a Supreme Court that protects our rights and our future. Thank you, Marge.
Thank you so much, Vanita. And now it's my real pleasure to introduce Senator Bob Casey. He's a really, really important member of the Senate Help Committee, a strong advocate for fair-minded judges on the bench, and a fierce, fierce, fierce advocate for the Affordable Care Act. Senator Casey, thank you so much for being with us and for all that you're doing.
Marge, thanks very much. And I want to thank people for the American Way for this opportunity. And I follow great presentations by Vanita and Nan and several of my colleagues in the Senate. So I'll try to be brief. I think most people by now know the numbers when it comes to the Affordable Care Act. Just to give it some context for Pennsylvania, what's at stake is instead of 135 million with pre-existing conditions, that number in Pennsylvania is 5.5 million. And the number of people who would lose coverage would be as many as 1 million. So you can see the numbers, but I'd even start even before getting to the case, just really focusing for a moment on who really selected Judge Barrett. Ultimately, mechanically, the president has to make that decision in a nomination. But long before the president made a decision, the vetting and the selection was really done by two far-right organizations, the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. I don't think most Americans, certainly not most Pennsylvanians, want the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society choosing the Supreme Court. But we know that Donald Trump came up with that list, or I should say ratified the list developed by those organizations. So Judge Barrett is simply the next in a line of corporate extreme judges who will be on a already corporate court, making it ever more so. And the Affordable Care Act, of course, is right in front of us in the argument on the 10th of November. I think a lot more Americans understand that now than they did maybe 2 weeks ago, but we still have a fight ahead of us these next couple of days. Your work, your voices, your intensity is not just valuable, it's essential. And I appreciate the work that so many have done already to make it clear to every single senator why we should not let extreme groups like that determine not just the nature of our justice system, but who actually sits on the United States Supreme Court. I thought it noteworthy that I heard Nan mention, I'm sure others have, that even on the question of Medicare, this nominee could not even say something affirmative and laudatory about that program. She could have very easily said, arguing, I guess by analogy, that there are super precedents with regard to Supreme Court decisions. There are also super precedents when it comes to legislative enactments, and Medicare is one of those. It's more than 50 years old. No American that I know wants to get rid of it, except some right-wing goofballs in law review articles who are extreme in their views of everything. But just by not answering that question and by pretending it was a contentious issue, I think Judge Barrett gave credence to those extreme loopy arguments that some are making in law review articles or other journals. So if you can't make some declarative statement about the value of Medicare, you can only imagine the hostility that is there when it comes to other parts of our law. But the Affordable Care Act is probably best articulated, or the value of it is probably best articulated by people that so many of our members of our caucus have spoken to. Some of them we've been talking to for years, a lot of moms who have children with disabilities, for example, but so many others in our states. And I'll just conclude with a reference to two, to Erin and to Shannon. Erin is the daughter of Abby, who has multiple disabilities. She has been fighting on her behalf for years. I met her in the 2017 fight on repeal of the ACA, but now she's had to suit up to go into battle again for her daughter, Abby, and her other children as well. And I also most recently met Shannon, who has a daughter, Sienna, with Down syndrome. There's no reason why these mothers, these families, these Americans should have to fight off yet another extreme right-wing attempt to destroy the Affordable Care Act and destroy so much else. So I know there's more to talk about, but I'll leave you with that. And thank you for the work you're doing. We're going to keep fighting every day.
Thank you so much, Senator Casey. Really appreciate your bringing home the baffling but really kind of frightening refusal of Barrett to answer questions about Social Security and Medicare, and to bring home the real stories of hope who really are truly going to be harmed if the Affordable Care Act is.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for being with us, and again for all of the work that you're doing. And now it's my deep pleasure to introduce the president of the National Education Association, Becky Pringle.
Hello, I am Becky Pringle, a science teacher and the proud president of the National Education Association, America's largest labor union. While we are in the midst of a raging pandemic that continues to spiral out of control, Donald Trump and Senate Republicans are putting our health care at risk by asking the Supreme Court just days after the election to strike down the Affordable Care Act. If they prevail, millions will lose their health care coverage, including many paraprofessionals in our public schools, and millions more will once again have health care coverage denied because of a pre-existing condition. In fact, for the 7 million Americans who have battled COVID-19, those side effects could now very well be considered pre-existing conditions. Republicans are rushing to confirm Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court because they are counting on her vote to strike down the ACA. Our communities are being ravaged by the COVID-19 pandemic, and Donald Trump, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and Senate Republicans have failed us. They have failed to provide an adequate COVID relief package to Americans who need it the most. And now they have failed us by ramming through a partisan Supreme Court nominee who will take away health care. This tells you everything you need to know about their priorities. They are more interested in taking away your health care than protecting communities, working families, and our students who desperately need support during this pandemic. As a teacher of over 30 years in the classroom, I've witnessed firsthand how the Supreme Court affects the lives of our nation's children, their families, and our communities. And I can tell you, Donald Trump, Senate Republicans, and Judge Barrett do not stand on our side. There is simply too much at stake. We must not be passive. We must speak up. We must act. The 3 million members of the NEA will fight for those who do not have a voice. And we will use the collective power of our voices by calling our senators in all 50 states to tell them to vote no on the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court.
Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you so much for being with us. And now I'd love to introduce, an honor to introduce Alex McGill Johnson, who is president of the Planned Parenthood Action Fund.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis McGill Johnson, president of Planned Parenthood Action Fund. Right now, our rights, our health, and our futures are on the line. Mitch McConnell is recklessly insisting on rushing a Supreme Court confirmation through the Senate. This process is already illegitimate. And now that members of the Senate have been diagnosed with COVID-19, it could become dangerous. Planned Parenthood Action Fund is fighting to stop Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation and any Supreme Court justice before the 2021 inauguration. President Trump said he would only nominate justices who would overturn Roe v. Wade. Amy Coney Barrett's record tells us that he picked her just to make good on this promise. We know there are 17 cases that are one step away from the Supreme Court that could determine access to abortion. We also know that 77% of Americans support access to safe and legal abortion. Our court should reflect that. Instead of focusing on the pandemic that has killed more than 210,000 Americans, that has infected over 7 million people, the Senate is ramming through a nominee who threatens our health and our rights. It's a disgrace to our democracy. It's a disgrace to the will of the people. And it's not just reproductive health that's on the line. The Trump administration and Mitch McConnell are again asking the Supreme Court to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, stripping coverage from nearly 30 million people. 133 million people have pre-existing conditions. They will face uncertainty. Amy Coney Barrett has strongly criticized both major decisions upholding the ACA. So we can't back down. There is so much we still need to do over the next few weeks. There's so much that we must do. We need you to call your senators today, and you can text SCOTUS to 22422 to get connected and tell them no confirmation before inauguration. Not before Election Day, not during the lame duck, not a single day before January 21st. Because it's not just Justice Ginsburg's seat that we're defending. It's the people's seat. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Alexis. I'm so delighted to have you with us. And now it's my privilege to introduce Juliana Murphy from New Orleans, Louisiana. Juliana, thank you so much for being with us. And I think you need to unmute.
Yes, I did. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. So the Affordable Care Act, specifically Medicaid expansion and Planned Parenthood, quite literally saved my life. In 2016, I was beginning my career as a cook here in New Orleans, only making $11 an hour. I couldn't afford health insurance like most people in my pay bracket. I was also struggling with extreme pain and excessive bleeding with my period, a condition that I'd lived with for about 10 years prior. There were months where I had to choose between paying my rent and buying groceries or going to the doctor. I couldn't afford both. So I was forced to live with my pain every month, calling out to work and ultimately losing my first job. Once the ACA passed here in Louisiana that year, a friend recommended that I apply for Medicaid. And I was a bit taken aback because I thought Medicaid was only for really poor people, and that wasn't me. I wasn't one of them. The fact is that I, along with the vast majority of Americans, actually are one of them. So I applied and I was accepted. After private doctors dismissed my symptoms because I was a Medicaid patient, I went to our Planned Parenthood clinic here in New Orleans to get checked out. I was promptly sent to the emergency room because of my alarming hemoglobin levels. My hemoglobin was a 3, when a normal hemoglobin is supposed to be a 12 to 14. The doctor on staff told me that I was in danger of dying of heart failure from the excessive bleeding from my period. I was then diagnosed with a rare uterine disease called adenomyosis that was previously undetected by the private doctors. A year later, I had a hysterectomy because my condition was so far gone, and it was completely covered by Medicaid. I would not be here living and breathing without the Affordable Care Act or Planned Parenthood. So Trump's administration is trying desperately to get rid of the ACA right now during a global pandemic that they downplayed. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs and hence their health insurance. Millions of Americans are living in destitution because our leaders have failed to provide a comprehensive stimulus package to bring relief. I was one of those Americans for 6 months this year. The restaurant that I worked in shut down, and I lost my job along with the health insurance that they provided. I relied on the federal and state unemployment just to get by, and I reapplied for Medicaid. Without Medicaid, I would not have been able to afford my asthma medication or the medication that I take for my anxiety. Both conditions that were heightened during this pandemic. When our federal stimulus ended in August, I, along with hundreds of thousands of Louisianians, received $247 a week or less to live on, when rent on average is $1,000 or more a month. Americans are being evicted daily from their homes because they can't afford to live. Americans are desperately seeking jobs in an economy that cannot provide them. Taking away critical health care from people that need it most during a time that we need it most is cruel. The Trump administration is not concerned about us, the working people. We have to make our needs and voices heard before it's too late. Our lives are literally on the line. And I'm going to reiterate this too, to please call and write your senators, especially if you live in a red state. We pay these leaders to work for us out of our tax dollars. The least they can do is save our healthcare during a pandemic.
Julie, thank you so much for being with us. I mean, your story shows the absolute perversity of the Senate focusing on putting on the bench a justice who is likely to dismantle healthcare protections at the same time that they're not doing COVID relief. So we appreciate your sharing your story with us today. And just as a reminder, anybody who's listening, This next week is critical. Please call your senators at 202-224-3121 and let them hear from you. So thank you so much. And it's now my pleasure to introduce a wonderful colleague, Erin Gabriel from Little Lobbyists. Thank you so much for being with us, Erin.
Hi, thank you for having me. And thank you especially to Senators Murray, Hirono, Cardin, and especially my own Senator Casey. I am Erin Gabriel. I am the Director of Advocacy for Little Lobbyists and the State Chapter Leader for Little Lobbyists Pennsylvania. More importantly, I am Abby, Bridget, and Colin's mom. That's a picture of them there. At Little Lobbyists, we advocate for the healthcare, education, and community our children with complex medical needs and disabilities need to survive and thrive. Unfortunately, the nomination of Judge Barrett puts all of that at risk. This is my youngest daughter, Abby. Oops. I'm trying to show you pictures. She just celebrated her 11th birthday, something that was never promised us. She is beautiful, fun, mischievous, and she loves playing with her big brother and sister, going to the theater, exploring the outdoors, and of course, all things Disney. She's also deafblind, autistic, and has a rare progressive neurological syndrome affecting multiple organ systems, causing seizures, muscle wasting, anemia, and fatigue. Medically, Abby's had to go through a lot, but thanks to the protections of the Affordable Care Act, protections for people with pre-existing conditions, a ban on lifetime caps, we have never had to worry about her access to health care. But in just 3 weeks, the Supreme Court will hear arguments that in a case that is trying to overturn the entirety of the ACA. Republicans are in such a hurry to confirm this Supreme Court justice nominee so they can rip away healthcare from millions of Americans, including my own daughter, in the middle of a pandemic and with absolutely no replacement plan. When Republicans talk about removing or weakening protections for people with pre-existing conditions, they mean removing access to the level of care that keep Abby and kids like her alive. When the party of pro-life talks about eliminating the ACA and the ban on lifetime caps, what they are really saying is that my friend's premature baby in the NICU should be removed from her incubator when her bill reaches a certain dollar amount, and that the machine sustaining her life should be turned off because that child's life is worth a certain dollar amount and not a penny more. So what can we do? Call your senators and keep calling them, and then vote. Vote like the lives of your children depend on it, because they do. Vote for candidates who will fight for all of our families so that Abby and kids like her can keep celebrating their birthdays. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. And I can't tell our listeners what an incredible fighter Erin is. And it's just such a joy to be in this fight with her. And Erin, your ability to tell your story is just so powerful because it really brings home what's at stake here, just the huge stakes. And so thank you very much. And we have with us another very powerful individual whose story is extremely compelling. And let me welcome Rachel Wall from Colorado to join us. And Rachel, I think you're on mute. There you go.
There we go. Thank you, Marge. And thank you everyone for being here today. I know it feels kind of surreal that we're here 2 weeks out from an election, watching our Senate majority refuse to pass any COVID relief or assistance bills, but barrel through, confirming a Supreme Court justice. It's easy to feel helpless right now, at least it is for me. So I really appreciate everyone here today giving your time and your energy and your words to this fight. It reminds me that I'm not alone. When I talk about what's at stake if the ACA is overturned, it isn't theoretical for me. I've spent most of my life fighting for access to the healthcare I need because I was born with a pre-existing condition. I have a rare genetic disease that causes episodes of mass swelling that range from simply painful to fully life-threatening. I obviously had no control over any of that, but it has been held against me for my whole life. Even when I was a kid on my dad's insurance, claims were frequently denied on the grounds of pre-existing conditions. And then as an adult, I bounced back and forth between junk plans that were costly but wouldn't cover anything that I needed, and then just not being able to get insurance at all. I so desperately needed care, but every time I had to fight or beg for the treatment that I needed, I believed I deserved it less and less. Our healthcare system taught me that I didn't deserve to be healthy because I was detrimental to profit margins. And I believed it. I did. I was extremely underweight. I had chronic respiratory illness, near constant pain, and I just lived in fear of my next swelling episode. I gradually stopped trying to live and just worked on surviving, with emergency rooms for life-threatening swelling becoming my only healthcare. I would sit at home holding my EpiPen as my throat swelled, trying not to use it, because if I use it, I have to replace it. And at the time, that would have cost my grocery budget for more than a month. I would then drive myself to the emergency room because I couldn't afford an ambulance. Trying to make that calculation, which can I afford this month, eating or breathing, is dehumanizing in ways that I can never really explain. But then the Affordable Care Act was passed, and suddenly I could access the treatment I had needed for my entire life, and my whole world changed. I became stronger and healthier, of course, but I gradually started to believe that maybe I did deserve to be healthy. And I began investing in myself for the first time ever. I pursued a career that I love. I made friends for the first time in a lot of instances. I built relationships and became part of my community. I started to run and I started to swim. And then I joined a triathlon team and started doing long distance triathlons. Basically, I stopped just surviving and I started living. I thought my fight was over after the ACA was passed, but from day one, Republican lawmakers have relentlessly attacked and undermined it. So much time that could have been spent expanding access and increasing protections instead has been spent on this petty power struggle. Donald Trump has made it his personal crusade to destroy the ACA through whatever means necessary. He has spent his presidency doing everything he can to tear it down. Now, with less than 2 weeks left until the election, he is trying to rush through confirming a judge who will side with him in his supported lawsuit to overturn the ACA and rip healthcare away from millions of people. Any senator who supports Trump in this blatant, appalling power grab does not deserve to be called a representative of the people. Yet my senator, Cory Gardner, has said that he will do just that. Other senators across the country are committing to do it as well. We're watching it play out with these sham hearings to confirm this justice. It's always unconscionable to try to restrict healthcare access, but exponentially more so in the midst of a global pandemic. The only goal here should be ensuring that everyone can get the care they need. But instead of fighting for the people who elected them, these senators are choosing to side with their party and side with special interests. This is a turning point in our country. There is still so much work to be done to ensure that everyone can access the health care that they need. Who we elect will determine if that work gets done or not. The ACA gave me my life and I won't give it back. Millions of lives just like mine are on the line. And so I'm asking you to join me in using your voice and using your vote in this election to resoundingly say that everyone deserves health care.
Rachel, thank you so much. Your story is so powerful, and it helps so much for listeners to be able to hear your story and understand the really incredible consequences from putting someone on the bench who we know is going to overturn the Affordable Care Act. So thank you so very much. And thank you to everybody for listening. We're going to set up and have a brief panel to answer questions. Will be Nan Aaron and Vanita Gupta and Aaron Gabriel and myself. And so hopefully we'll get to a couple of questions that folks have sent in. I also just want to remind folks how important it is. This next week is absolutely critical. The Senate Judiciary Committee votes on Thursday. If Barrett nomination comes out of committee, the vote will be on the floor soon after for a full Senate vote. It is so critical over this next week to do anything you can. Call your senators and tell them just to pause, wait, let the people decide. Let this vacancy be filled by the next president of the United States. That number is 202-224-3121, 202-224-3121. Anything that you can do, it really makes a huge difference, especially even in this time of where we're working remotely. Having the senators' phones ring off the hook makes a difference. That's the way they know that people care and people are paying attention. So I think we have our panel assembled, and so and I know things are very tight with time, but just want to start out with a question, and maybe I'll ask Nan to respond first, and then maybe Aaron. But Nan, we've been through a lot of these fights over Supreme Court vacancies. This one is just so different and so unprecedented. And could you just speak to that a minute? Just give people some perspective about what we're seeing here.
This, Marge, you're absolutely right. This is a consequential move because it will flip the court dramatically in a direction that will undo so much of the progress that Americans have made over the past decades. We've seen incremental nominees comprising small majorities, but if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed, she will comprise a 6-3 majority on the court. And it's not just we and our organizations and members who are fighting this, but it's important for people to remember that not only will we be affected, our children will be impacted by who sits on the court, our grandchildren, because at the end of the day, while Donald Trump will be in office 4 years, maybe 8 years, his justices will be on the court long after he leaves office making decisions, and a 6-3 majority will simply take us back, not forward, and eradicate so much of the progress that we've made over the years.
Yeah, thank you, Nan. And the other thing that I would also add is that Barrett's refusal to answer questions was unprecedented. The refusal to say that voter intimidation is illegal, refusal to say that the president can't unilaterally change the date of the election, refusal to say, as Senator Casey was pointing out, that Medicare and Social Security are constitutional, refusal to admit that climate change was real. All of those were exceptional silence on her part, more so, I think, than we've seen from any nominee. And it really portends concerns about whether that means that all of those questions she thinks are open to some examination, even though, there are laws against voter intimidation and a law that says you can't, the president can't unilaterally, change the election. So that piece of it was troubling as well. Aaron, I was wondering, folks were wondering, could you tell us a little bit about Little Lobbyists, but also give us some hope here, because this seems like a really, really hard fight. And so how do you keep going, and how do how do you fight through when the odds are feel so stacked against us?
Well, it's the kind of fight that many of our families have been having for years. It's just a different kind of advocacy, I suppose, than what most people are used to. But I think families of children with complex medical needs and disabilities are quite accustomed to having to advocate in life and death matters for their children, whether it be with a doctor at a hospital bedside or just fighting for the access that they need to the education that they need. Little Lobbyists is a family-led organization. We advocate for the healthcare, education, and community inclusion that all of our children with complex medical needs and disabilities need to not just survive, but to thrive here in our country and wherever they may go. We find hope, I guess, through our children. We bring them with us. They get to speak with legislators themselves. You heard Senator Casey mention both my family and another family, a local family from here in Pittsburgh, because those children get to meet those senators and they get to have those conversations with them one-on-one. And I think it's really important that we put a face on healthcare, that we put a face on all of these decisions that are being made. Sometimes everything can feel very abstract when it's just legislative stuff with bill numbers and dollar signs. Right. But when you meet the children that are being affected by your decisions first, because many of our families feel very much like canaries in the coal mine. All of these things affect our families, but they affect your families too. So I have hope. I see a lot of people mobilizing. I think that there is still a chance to stop this nomination. And I also think that sharing our stories helps to persuade legislators later on to perhaps legislate in ways that will help our families survive whatever is to come.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being in this fight. I've also wanted to note that we've gotten a question about what can people do in DC, since DC sadly does not have a senator. And when I have thought about this question before, I usually think of the 6 degrees of separation, that if you live in DC, you know people who are living in, you have relatives, colleagues, friends, acquaintances who are living in some of these key states like Colorado and like Iowa and like North Carolina. And so if you can, reach out to them and tell them how urgent this is. This next week is critical. So there are things, yes, we don't have, those who live in DC don't have the senator, but try to figure out who you know who can be influential in the states that are really critical. And then I think we have time for one last question. We're getting a lot of questions about this, and so I'll throw this both to Nan and to Aaron. But people want a nonpartisan Supreme Court. They want a court that's fair-minded. They want a court that doesn't seem stacked against them. And so, what are the solutions here? What can we do? We if Barrett's confirmed, are gonna face a 6-3 stacked court. What are the options? Nan, do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. Well, I do think we will quickly see that a 6-3 court is not really representative of our wonderful country and our wonderful democracy. There are a number of options under consideration. One of them is to eliminate the legislative filibuster in the Senate. One is to make DC and Puerto Rico states. And a third option is to expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court, not in order to seek revenge, but in order to make the court more independent, more fair-minded, and in a sense to democratize the court. After all, that 6-3 majority that we will have represent just a thin slice of Americans, and more importantly, a particular view of the law. And that view of the law seeks to take us back to a time when there were no civil rights, women's rights, environmental, consumer, worker protections. None of us wants a country that doesn't recognize and respect the progress that we've made. And therefore, I do think expanding the number of justices would democratize that institution, and equally important, restore confidence in its ability to give everyone in America, not just those representative of a thin slice in this country, a fair shake. And that's the hope and promise of our federal judiciary.
Thank you. And I think there's a huge amount of energy around this. And so I think it's really important that we examine all possibilities here. Erin, do you have some thoughts?
This is probably above my pay grade. It's frightening. I will say that it is very, very frightening because it's not just about the ACA, it's about Medicaid. Frequently, there have been cases that have been brought up through the courts about Medicaid work requirements, for example. And a lot of our families, including my own, rely on Medicaid to kind of fill that gap between what is covered by a private insurance and what is being, required by your child's health condition. And Medicaid is the single largest insurer in the country, and many people with disabilities rely on Medicaid to access the services that they need to just, get their day going.
Right.
So it is very frightening. Accessibility issues, LGBTQI+ issues. It's very, very frightening. So I like all of Nan's ideas. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't pretend to know the best way to solve this issue.
As some of my best friends, I'm a lawyer, but say stop bragging that you're not a lawyer. But no, I think we are going to find out that the 6-3 court is like hugely threatening to any number of rights. I mean, the rights we've been talking about today, LGBTQ equality, workers' rights, climate justice. I mean, just every issue one could imagine. So Nan's framing around democratizing the court is something for us to be thinking about. So once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I know we went a bit over, but really appreciate you spending the time with us. Remember, call your senators. This next week is critical, 202-224-3121 and onward. And thank you again so much for joining us. It's nice to know that we are in this fight with so very many activists around the country. Thank you all.
Thank you, Marge, and People for.